Hey guys, This video is up just in case you missed class on Friday the 15th of February, or in the case of one of my sections, Monday or Tuesday the 19th. That would be today. We talked about non-canonical gospels, basically the gospel-like texts that didn't make it into the Bible. And basically, because we used this unit to talk about what a gospel was, what the word means, using Mark's gospel as an example, I thought it could be interesting now that we've taken the test to take a look at some things that would not make the cut. Sometimes it's as helpful to define things based on what they are not, as it is to define things based on what they are. So here goes. Our definition is right here. A gospel is an ancient biography, that is, one more concerned with relational knowledge, big picture knowledge, than it is with informational knowledge, about Jesus. That's pretty important. It's not about Jesus, it's not a gospel. For a specific audience, that one's a little tougher, but if you do come across a text where it's a little bit hard to tell who it might have been written for, it may be worth keeping in mind that it wouldn't make that cut. That speaks of a future where everyone acts out of love. That is the kingdom of God. If it doesn't speak of that, then it's not complete. It's got to contain the story of the passion, the death, and resurrection of Jesus. Again, otherwise the message of the gospel would not be complete. And it has to promise that we too will be risen and perfected. In other words, that God participating in the human experience, in person of Jesus Christ, opens the door, so to speak, for humans to participate in the divine experience of the resurrection, of eternal life, and of complete union with God. That should all sound somewhat familiar from the unit. If it doesn't, then what I said in the last minute or so won't make much sense, and you should probably come talk to me. But anyway, to recap, here's how Mark made his gospel, how Mark's gospel fits the definition that we came up with. Jesus is represented as faithful, good, and compassionate. In other words, his character is depicted properly. Mark's audience is struggling. In other words, Mark clearly has a discernible audience and seems to be gearing the gospel message toward them. Mark proves that the world and the people in it are ultimately good. We're going to talk about this later in the video, but it's very important in Christianity that we believe that the world and everything in it are ultimately worthy of redemption. There are other groups that don't believe that, and there are groups in the earliest Christian era that don't believe that. We have to talk about them because they're some of the groups that were suppressed in the early days. Finally, also, Jesus gives people hope. If the gospel message doesn't have hope in it, obviously it can't make the cut. Christianity survived and thrived because of its hopeful message. So if it does something like say, oh, just give up and run with it, not okay. So here's some reasons to reject a text. This is more or less the inverse of the previous slide. If something that Mark did to meet the definition, so to speak, is absent, or its opposite is present, then it can't be in the gospel. It can't be in the Bible. So it gives a wrong picture of Jesus' character. We're going to see a couple examples of that happening. No passion or resurrection story. Now, obviously, that doesn't have to be in every paragraph, but if it's absent, it really doesn't give a complete picture of what it is to know Jesus. And that relational knowledge really does rely on the reality of the passion and the resurrection, because otherwise it doesn't really mean as much. If it doesn't promise that the world is good and loved, right? In other words, if it says that the world is terrible and to be escaped, that's an issue. And finally, if it says that there is an evil God, we're going to talk about that in a minute also, or says that people aren't good. The evil God thing, sometimes people will ask me, well, isn't Satan kind of like an evil God? Strictly speaking, no, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. Anyway, I asked the class to read bits and pieces of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. This was what I asked you to read on the day of the test, so you may have already seen this link. If not, the link will be in the description to this video. But read it, really. It's quite interesting, especially read paragraphs 3 and 4. And I think you'll pretty readily see why this wouldn't have been able to make the cut. Now, the History Channel will tell you that a lot of these Gospels that don't make it into the Bible were suppressed for political reasons. And to a certain point, that's true. All human decisions are in some way political. The other reason, though, that we would reject this, bad character, disrespectful, right? And also, no passion or resurrection. It's just stories of Jesus' childhood. Um, Probably more importantly, just on a historical note, the other thing is some of these texts weren't ever meant to be taken seriously. So the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, for example, and I didn't write this in the slides, but the Infancy Gospel of Thomas was written as sort of early Christian fan fiction, if you will. And if we think about it, the early church is developing and coming up with, clarifying what Christianity really is. And they have a problem, which is that the four Gospels, or the Gospels that they're dealing with, largely don't deal with Christ's childhood. Now imagine little kids would be in the group probably asking what Jesus was like at their age. These were just sort of stories that came up. They were always meant to be taken sort of tongue-in-cheek, though, which is a good fourth reason why the text was not included. The other group of texts we need to talk about are called the Gnostic Texts. Gnosticism is interesting, so bear with me for a minute, because I'm not going to be scrolling up too many points early on here. They were an early type of Christian. All right, but that's where the parallels with modern Christianity kind of stop. Modern Christianity, or the type of Christianity that survived, which we call Orthodox Christianity, I guess, believes in what's called a monistic cosmology. Now, that's a giant word you don't really need to know. But basically, it believes that goodness really exists, but evil only exists as the absence of goodness. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense when I first say it to people, but think about it for a minute. You already know examples of other things that work this way. Cold, for example, is an absence of heat. You know that from science class. When you heat something up, you're adding energy to it. When something cools down, it kind of usually just happens passively. That's why refrigeration took us so much longer to figure out. But you're taking energy out of something. So cold is a lack of heat. Likewise, darkness is a lack of light. When you turn the lights off in the room, it gets dark because you subtracted something, not because you added something. Christians believe that Christians believe that evil works the same way. Evil is simply a rejection of good. And that is really important, actually, for a couple of reasons. One is, if evil doesn't exist except as a rejection of goodness, then evil can't win. Because if evil were to defeat good, there would be nothing left to reject, and therefore evil would also be defeated. That's really weird and philosophical, but I think it weirdly makes good sense a lot of the time to people, so hopefully you understand what I'm saying. The other point that's important is that it explains why evil people or evil groups throughout history tend not to have any kind of shared goal. Good people from time to time and place to place tend to usually be pulling in the same direction towards goodness. Evil people, as you've seen, pull in all different directions, and basically the idea is they're not really headed towards anything, they're just headed away. Now, as opposed to monistic systems, there are dualistic systems. A dualistic system holds that there are in fact two independent principles, a good and an evil, and that evil is not a rejection of goodness, it is a thing of itself. So, what does that mean? It means that either evil or good could win, and that we're sort of caught in a tug of war between the two. A lot of people say, well, aren't we in a tug of war between God and Satan? Satan is just sort of the chief of those who rejected goodness. And when he pulls people, he's pulling them away from God, not towards himself, if that makes any sense. If you've ever heard of the poem Paradise Lost, I believe Satan's quote is something like, "It's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven." He rejects. He doesn't actually have a goal, just something to run away from. The Gnostics fall into this second camp, though, the dualistic people. And they believe that humans are a combination of an evil body and a good soul. Basically, they steal an idea from Plato in a book that he wrote called the Timaeus. You don't have to worry about that, but that says that there is a good God that created the spiritual realm. So spirits are good. And then there was an evil, mean old god that decided to create physical matter, which was evil, in order to entrap souls. So all of the physical matter around you, according to the Gnostics, is evil. Wherever you're sitting, your chair is evil. Your shoes are evil. Everything's evil. And your soul is the only good thing. Humans are the unique thing where spiritual being and physical being are one and the same. So we are good souls trapped in an evil body, and basically we go through these endless cycles of reincarnation where we keep getting trapped in new bodies. And they thought that somehow in Jesus' teaching was a secret bit of knowledge that they needed in order to escape the physical world and return to the spiritual realm when they died the next time. If you think about it, this is pretty similar to the Heaven's Gate folks, the ones who drank the Kool-Aid thinking that they would be able to go to the comet. There was some secret bit of knowledge they needed to be saved, right? That's that idea. The other type of Gnosticism that kind of exists now is people who think that they just have to say they're Christian in order to go to heaven. In other words, they can do whatever they want, but as long as they know the content of Christianity, they're fine. That's problematic too, although a little bit less so. Anyway, Gnostics don't last very long for a lot of reasons. One is, admittedly, that they were suppressed by the early church in the 4th century. That is to say that imperial and church politics in the ancient Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, kind of caused them to be eliminated, so to speak. They also had other problems, though, which is that it's not a particularly compelling or hopeful philosophy. They had low birth rates. There were some groups that were hesitant to eat. They had suicide rates that were surprisingly high, things like that. But anyway, their texts show certain characteristics. They're concerned about knowing something. So you'll see that some of their texts aren't stories, they're just lists of quotes. Because, of course, if you just need to know the secret teaching that Jesus gave you, you don't need to know his life. They believe that Jesus came from the good God, had mercy enough to take on physical matter, although in some cases they believe that he wasn't physically there. Anyway, and was there to tell people the secret knowledge they needed to know to escape. So they're not concerned with the story. They also do something else that's interesting, which is that they show the Old Testament God as evil. Some of them do, anyway. Gnostics are very diverse. But anyway, in other words, the Old Testament God, right on the first page of his book, in Genesis, says, proudly confesses to having created all the physical matter. So, of course, if physical matter is evil, so is the Old Testament God. Now, if you take a look at the other link, the Gospel of Thomas, in other words, not the Infancy Gospel, just the regular old Gospel, this is a classic Gnostic text. And if you were to take a look at verses 1 through 3, you'll see that they don't make a whole lot of sense. You would have to really think them through to figure out what they mean. And that's what the Gnostics were all about. If you skip forward to the very end, to verse 114, you'll see another nasty tendency of the Gnostics, which is to hate on women something fierce. If you think about it, if you hate physical existence, women could be seen in a particularly negative light because they give birth. In other words, they are the mechanism, that's a horrible way to put it, but this is how the Gnostics would have seen it, the mechanism by which more souls become entrapped in physical existence. Kind of messed up, but you get the idea. So here's the reasons why that had to be rejected. One final thing I want to show you is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is frequently cited as a really, what people believe is a compelling example that the early church hated women. Admittedly, the early church, as much of the church's history is, this is true, was very patriarchal. Men were in charge. They did not, however, hate women, and it's important for us to understand them in their proper ancient context so that we can realize that. However, people nonetheless try to make the argument that this gospel was suppressed because it was written by a woman, and that's terrible. But if you look at it closely, it also is kind of out there, right? It's still about knowledge, doesn't really tell much of a story. There is more to it, but, it also contains those same ideas. You look at this, matter gave birth to a passion which has no image. Matter, physical matter, giving birth to a passion could refer to sex. The Gnostics were also, in many cases, very much against reproducing, because again, that would simply entrap more souls. They were also against things like charity, right? Which could help poor people get their sort of lesser passions. In other words, not sexual passion necessarily, but, If you're hungry enough, you're going to have a passion for food. If you're cold enough, you're going to have a passion for shelter, etc. Right? So they had a lot of really wonky views that kind of put pretty far out there. Now, for the next bit, if you are in one of my college prep classes, which would be A4, A6, and B3, your job is to write one gospel that could match the definition that we had several slides ago, right at the beginning of this video, and then one other that couldn't. Now, if you were present for class, then your job was then to switch with somebody else and analyze his work. If you were absent, what I want you to do is just write those two gospels, each a paragraph long, and then give me a little explanation as to which one is which and why. Please keep them appropriate. I understand that this Gospel of Thomas was very sexist. I understand that there are probably some other sort of offensive ways you could take this. Don't do so. Don't take this in a sexist direction. This text is very old. Yours is being written in 2019, so please be careful. And then you'll just kind of hand that in on Monday the 25th. If you are in one of my accelerated or honors classes, that would be A1, A3, and B2, you will write one gospel that would match the definition of a gospel, one that would be sort of like the infancy gospel in showing Jesus' character the wrong way, and one that would be Gnostic in its style. So you saw some examples of what Gnostic texts might look like. And then you will, again, analyze your texts, tell me which one is which and why. If you were present for class when we talked about this, then of course you'll be analyzing somebody else's work. If you were absent, just go ahead and analyze your own. It is also due to On Campus on February 25th. If you have any questions, let me know, but this should be pretty straightforward, so I hope it is. Good luck.